Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Firstly, my thanks to Shaykh Dr for inviting me to speak at this event. And I reiterate everything. I won't repeat what Shaykh Suhail said, but I'll reiterate what he said about me, about him as well, in terms of our fiqhi journey that we've been taking over the past decade and more. For the sake of time, I will just dive straight into my presentation over here. I have a bad habit of making too many slides, and that's why I'm a little worried that I won't get through all of them. But the title of my paper today is called Authority in the Classical Hanafi School, the Emergence and Evolution of Zahir al Riwaya, which is a paper that I published. It's quite a lengthy paper. It's about 16,000 words. My supervisor, when I sent him this paper, he told me to cut it in half, but I didn't want to do that. So there is a lot of material that I have to get through. I'm not going to be covering all the paper, but only some salient bits. And whoever is interested in reading the details can look at the paper and find those details therein. So what basically I'm going to discuss in this presentation is, firstly, what is Zahir al Riwaya for those non-Hanafis who might not be familiar with this particular term? When did it first appear, and how was it popularized? Some three sort of simple questions, simple discussions, but which have quite a bit of detail to unpack around them. And so people who are not familiar with the idea of Zahir al Riwaya, basically Zahir al Riwaya refers to a taxonomy of legal sources, of authoritative legal sources that later Hanafi scholars develop, particularly when discussing the practice of fatwa and giving tarjih or preponderance to specific legal opinions over others. And within this taxonomy of legal sources, you have Zahir al Riwaya, Nawadir, and Nawazir. And Zahir al Riwaya sits at the top of this hierarchy, and it is basically defined by later scholars like Ibn Abidin as legal opinions that have been transmitted in 6 books that have been authored by Imam Muhammad. And these books are also referred to as the usul. And so according to most scholars, Zahir al Riwaya and usul are synonymous terms to refer to these 6 books. And these 6 books are deemed by later scholars to be widely transmitted or mashhur from the Hanafi masters. And they are Kitab al-Asl, Jami' al-Kabir, Jami' al-Saghir, and then Asir al-Kabir, Asir al-Saghir, and Az-Ziyadat. There is some debate that scholars have regarding whether the Zahir al Riwaya corpus is 3 books or 4 books or 5 books or 6 books. But at least what most people are taught is that it refers to these 6 books. And these 6 books are considered mashhur or widely transmitted from Imam Muhammad. And therefore, because of their wide-scale transmission, at least in later scholarship, in the late classical Hanafi school, the opinions within this particular corpus are considered to be first-order precedent when it comes to tarjih. And what that means is that the opinions found in the Zahir al Riwaya corpus are given preference to the opinions found in other sources that are ascribed to the Hanafi masters. Then we have the Nawadir, which are opinions that have been transmitted in sources other than those of Zahir al Riwaya. And so a book like Ikhtilaf Abi Hanifa ibn Abi Layla that Shaykh Suhail mentioned, the Imla of Bishr al-Walid, of Ibn Sama'a, of all these other jurists that are not from these 6 books of Imam Muhammad are considered the Nawadir. And these are second order precedent because later scholars deem them to be not so widely transmitted from the Hanafi masters. And therefore they occupy a type of second tier when it comes to the process of tarjih that a jurist is meant to follow when he is giving legal preference to one opinion over another. And then finally, we have the Nawazil, which are legal opinions that are not found ascribed to any of the Hanafi masters. They are not found in the Zahir al Riwaya, they are not found in Nawadir, but these are opinions deduced by later generations of jurists for issues that have no answer directly from the Hanafi masters themselves. And the earliest book in this area is the Fatawa or the Nawazil of Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, which has recently been published by Dar al-Kutub Ilmiya. And again, I use recently in the same way that Sheikh Suhail does, referring to anything in the last decade or two. And so this work recently came out, and it is quite a rich resource for early Hanafi fatwa opinions that fall into the category of Nawazil. That's simply a very sort of basic overview of what Zahir al Riwaya means in the late classical tradition that most Hanafis who have studied Hanafi law are familiar with. What I want to do is I want to embark on more of a historical journey over here to see, okay, where did this idea of Zahir al Riwaya come from? When did it appear? How was it viewed by jurists? Was it viewed in the same way when it first appeared as it was in later periods? And so this is the first question that I want to address. When did Zahir al Riwaya appear? When was this particular term or variants of this particular term to refer to some type of authoritative textual corpus? When did jurists first start using or introducing this term within their own legal discourse? Now, for most of the 3rd and 9th century Hijri and much of the 4th and 10th century Hijri, and of course, this is the period in which you have figures like al-Tahawi and al-Karkhi and al-Jassas active. During this period, you do not find references to the term Zahir al Riwaya, nor any reference to terms that could be considered variants of Zahir al Riwaya. This is, of course, not very surprising, and the reason for this is because during much of the 3rd, 9th century, the madhab has not evolved into what we refer to as a doctrinal school. It's not yet an authoritative entity. And when we look at typologies, whether it's of jurists or whether it's taxonomies of texts, these are actually reflections of a madhab that has evolved into a more authoritative entity. Because what a taxonomy of legal literature is trying to do is that it is trying to give guidelines to Hanafi jurists who are consciously Hanafi. They're following a particular madhab. It is giving them guidelines of how they are meant to deal with the plurality of opinions that are found within their legal school, and to determine what exactly is considered authoritative doctrine within their legal school. And so for much of the 3rd, 9th century, the Hanafi school has not yet evolved into this doctrinal entity. It is not a legal school that is an authoritative legal entity, which has substantive boundaries that define the outer limits of the school, and where jurists are actively engaged in a process of trying to sort out the various plurality of opinions that are ascribed to the Hanafi masters with a view to what should the fatwa position be on this issue. And so without the Hanafi school as a doctrinal entity, the question of a taxonomy of legal literature is obviously not going to be something that jurists are entertaining. Rather, in the 3rd, 9th century, they have a different set of interests and a different focus and a different type of activity when it comes to how they are engaging with the law. But at the same time, what we can see during this particular period, this early period, immediately after the death of Imam Muhammad dies in 189. From 189 of the Hijri calendar up until, like 340, 350, what you find is there's this gradual evolution, these gradual shifts that you can identify, which is paving the way for the emergence of this understanding of some type of authoritative corpus. And so the 3 things that I want to focus on when it comes to this, these gradual shifts, is firstly, the importance that is ascribed to the legal text authored by Imam Muhammad by some of these early jurists. Secondly, the emergence of what I call an authorizing discourse. And thirdly, a phenomenon where jurists are actually actively delineating different corpuses and categorizing them in different ways within their legal texts. And so when it comes to this first point, the importance of the legal text authored by Muhammad, we can tell that there are already certain texts from a very early period that jurists are they're more eager to, or they're taking a more, they're more interested in transmitting these texts as opposed to some of the other texts that have been ascribed to the Hanafi masters. And Kitab al-Asl is, of course, one such example, because it is an extremely widely transmitted text. And you can see that when it comes to the transmission of Kitab al-Asl, you'll find that it is transmitted from one part of the Islamic world in Transoxiana, and it is also finding transmission from figures who are in the on the other side of the Islamic world in areas like Egypt and the Maghrib. And so the transmission of Kitab al-Asl, the fact that it is being transmitted by people like Abu Sulaiman and Abu Habs al-Kabir and Asad ibn al-Furat and others, shows that this was a widely transmitted text. And this wide-scale transmission is occurring literally right after the time of Imam Muhammad by his direct students. Al-Jami al-Kabir and Al-Jami al-Saghir have, similarly, a very wide-scale transmission when it comes to the various regions within which they are circulating. And this is, of course, not to say that texts of Nawadir were also not widely transmitted. In fact, some of them were quite popular and widely transmitted. But what we oftentimes find with some of the texts of Nawadir is that they seem to resemble a type of class notes that a student is taking. So if you look at the Mu'alla bin Mansur al-Razi, you'll find that it does not seem like a final text. It seems like a kind of a student notebook where he is transcribing the opinions of the Hanafi masters that he's hearing in various halaqat and majalis, but it is not an actual final text that Abu Yusuf is conveying to his students, unlike a work like Kitab al-Asl or a work like Jami al-Kabir and the Jami al-Saghir and others. So this is the first thing that we see when it comes to some of these works, that some of these works are being widely transmitted relative to other works. The second thing is the emergence of commentary literature. And the earliest commentary literature that we find is from the second half of the 3rd, 9th century. And these are works of commentary on Al-Jami al-Kabir and Al-Jami al-Saghir of Imam Muhammad. The earliest commentary that we have on Al-Jami al-Kabir is by the teacher of Imam al-Tahawi, Abu Khazim Abdul Hamid. And the earliest commentary that we know of on Al-Jami al-Saghir was authored by Imam al-Tahawi himself. And as Dr. Melcher observes, he states in his formation of the Sunni schools that the writing of commentaries on these earlier works, what does this acknowledge? It acknowledges that some of these works had incomparably more weight than anything coming after. And so when we see that Abu Khazim is writing a commentary on Jami al-Kabir, and then al-Tahawi on Jami al-Saghir, and this inaugurates literally a type of chain reaction where now you find jurists from every single generation after Abu Khazim and after al-Tahawi engaging in this act of commentary on these two works of Imam Muhammad. This shows the importance, or cements the importance, of these works in the minds of jurists. And there are various other indications of how important a work like Kitab al-Asl, Al-Jami al-Kabir, and Al-Jami al-Saghir were. When you look at the historical record, you find students who are actively transmitting these works. You find students who are actively studying these works. You find even the Ashab al-Hadith, according to one report, requested Imam Ahmad whether they could memorize the Jami al-Saghir of Imam Muhammad, and Imam Ahmad told them that they should avoid doing so. But all this points to the importance that was being given to some of these works by Imam Muhammad. And then we have a second phenomenon, which is called authorizing discourse. And so we have the transmission of certain texts, and then we have the emergence of authorizing discourse, again, largely in the second half of the 3rd, 9th century. And authorizing discourse is basically to use terms like, this is sahih, this is mashhur, this is da'if, this is X, Y, and Z, when trying to assess particular legal opinions ascribed to the masters. And what this authorizing discourse, again, what it is doing is that it is trying to sift out what a jurist feels is an authoritative legal opinion or a correct legal opinion from those that are non-authoritative or unsound or worthy of being critiqued in some manner or the other. For our sake, and the question of Zahir al Riwaya, the most important authorizing term that we can think about is mashhur, right? Because what is Zahir al Riwaya in later periods? It is precisely the 6 books of Imam Muhammad that have been transmitted by way of this type of ishtihar. They gain this ishtihar, or this wide-scale transmission. And what we find is that the earliest usage of this term mashhur, that this is Abu Yusuf's mashhur position, or this is Abu Hanifa's mashhur position, is from the middle of the 3rd, 9th century as well, in the work of a source that people oftentimes have not consulted, and many people don't even know about, which is Al-Haytham bin Sulaiman al-Qaysi's his book on the Adab al-Qadi. He references the mashhur of Abu Yusuf in there, and then from him onwards, you find Tahawi referencing it, you find Abu Khazim, you find Al-Karhi, and various other jurists. And most importantly, what you also find is the idea of the mashhur now finally being addressed in the first initial fatwa guidelines that are being issued by Hanafi jurists. And so in the Nawazil of Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, Abu Nasr al-Balkhi, who dies in 305, he is asked a question where he's asked about these 4 books, the Kitab of Ibn Rustam, the Adab al-Qadi al-Khassaf, al-Mujarrad of al-Hasan bin Ziyad, and al-Nawadir of Hisham. Is it permitted for us to issue legal rulings based on these texts or not? And what does Abu Nasr al-Balkhi, what does he say? He says, what is authentically transmitted from the Hanafi masters is knowledge that is cherished, desired, and sufficient. However, in regard to legal rulings, I do not view it as permissible for an individual to issue one except on the basis of his own understanding. And so he has an ijtihadi, initially his answer is a very ijtihadi answer, that a jurist should rely on his own ijtihad. But as for those legal opinions that have become well known, manifest, and related from our companions, then I'm hopeful there's allowance to rely upon them when addressing newly arising issues. And so over here, we get a taste of these 2 terms, of something being mashhur and something being manifest. And this is a very important statement by Abu Nasr, because it's the first time we're seeing these terms used specifically within the context of guidelines for fatwa that a jurist is being given. And interestingly, in the question itself, all the sources that are being mentioned in the question are sources that jurists in later periods consider from the Nawadir category. They do not consider this from the Zahir al Riwaya texts or corpus, they consider it from the Nawadir category. And so it shows that this period was one in which some attention was being dedicated by individuals to try and figure out, okay, what are authoritative legal texts that we can base our fatwas upon. Finally, we have this idea of delineation of corpuses. And so Zahir al Riwaya is one corpus, and the Nawadir is one corpus. And we find this delineation again appearing towards the beginning of the 4th, 10th century. And perhaps the most influential individual to offer a type of delineation in his own legal text is Abu Layth al-Samarkandi. Because Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, what does he do? He has his book, Uyun al-Masail, and he says about Uyun al-Masail that these are legal cases. This book that I'm writing, Uyun al-Masail, these are legal rulings from our ashab that were not related in Kitab al-Asl, al-Jami' al-Kabir, al-Jami' al-Saghir, and the Ziyadat. And then he has the Kitab al-Nawazil, which are legal cases that later jurists have ruled on that are not found in the works of the early Hanafi imams. And so he's really setting down, Abu Layth al-Samarkandi is setting down a type of tripartite delineation of these corpuses, where you have a set of legal cases that are found in Al-Asl, al-Jami' al-Kabir, al-Jami' al-Saghir, and al-Ziyadat. Then you have cases that are not found in these books, and I'm going to include them in Uyun al-Masail. And then we have cases that are derivations of later jurists, and I'm going to include those in Fatawa al-Nawazil. And so this tripartite division is, in effect, being inaugurated by someone like Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, and even before him by someone like Al-Hakim al-Shahid, whose Al-Kafi is an abridgment of Kitab al-Asl, al-Jami' al-Kabir, and al-Jami' al-Saghir, and his book Al-Muntaqa is one that gathers Nawadir material. And so you get this in the minds of these early jurists. They're already making distinction between, okay, we have this particular corpus, Al-Asl, al-Jami' al-Kabir, al-Jami' al-Saghir, al-Ziyadat, etc. And then we have this Nawadir corpus. And these are two, in a way, distinct corpuses of writing and opinions from the Hanafi masters. And so if we were to, put this down chronologically in terms of how these shifts are happening, you have the death of Imam Muhammad, you have the transmission of his works. This, of course, begins in the lifetime of Imam Muhammad, but continues on afterwards for much of the first half of the 3rd, 9th century. Some of these works are more widely transmitted than others. You have the emergence of this idea of the mashhur opinion, as well as commentary literature that also indicates that perhaps some works are being given more importance than others, or some opinions are being given more importance than others in terms of their widespread transmission in nature. Then you have this creeping into fatwa guidelines towards the latter half of the 3rd, 9th century. Then you have a type of corpus delineation towards the turn of the 4th, 10th century. And then you get your first reference to Zahir al Riwaya immediately afterwards in the middle of the 4th, 10th century. And who is the first one to mention this particular phrase or a variant of this phrase? It is Abu Layth al-Samarkandi himself in his work Fatawa al-Nawazil. And if you look at my paper on this, I basically reproduce all the instances that I could find in Kitab al-Nawazil and Uyun al-Masail as well of the usage of Zahir al-Riwaya in Kitab al-Nawazil of Abu Layth al-Samarkandi. And what's interesting about his usage is that, he oftentimes he does use it in a tarjihi context, meaning he will transmit an opinion and then he'll say هذا القول خلاف ما قال في الروايات الظاهرة, that this position opposes what is in الروايات الظاهرة فإنه قال في الجامع الصغير, and then he'll mention the opinion. In another position he mentions لكن هذه رواية غير مشهورة وفي الروايات الظاهرة جازة. This narration that I've mentioned, this opinion that I've mentioned, goes against what is mashhur from the Imams. As for what is in the riwayat al-Zahira, it is permissible. And so you find a clear tarjihi element in the discourse of Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, where this term riwayat al-Zahira is being used to compare one set of opinions with another set of opinions, where riwayat al-Zahira is being associated or contrasted with what is not mashhur. And this is sort of, setting the groundwork for the emergence of this topic or this idea in later periods. There are two challenges, though, with Abu Layth's discussion on or his usage of Zahir al Riwaya. The first is that he only uses it about 6 or 7 times in all of his works. If you look at all of his works, his Fatawa Nawazil, his Uyun al-Masail, he only uses this term 6 or 7 times, which might signal to us that it wasn't really that perhaps prominent of an idea in the minds of jurists at that time. On the other hand, he actually never defines what a riwayat al-Zahira is, meaning that people who are hearing it, presumably they know what this term means. Secondly, it's not altogether clear whether Abu Layth al-Samarkandi is referring to a corpus of text or if he's referring to a corpus of transmission. Because remember, in later periods, the Zahir al Riwaya is an authoritative corpus of texts, not simply of transmission. And we know, just as Dr. Suhail was mentioning, that At-Tahawi is of course earlier than Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, but even Abu Layth al-Samarkandi is receiving works through these full chains. He's receiving these works of Imla, for example, from Abu Yusuf, and he's conveying his reception of these works without actually mentioning that this is the Imla of Abu Yusuf, through these complete chains of transmission. And so transmission of legal works was still an ongoing activity even during the time of Abu Layth al-Samarkandi, even though it had reduced a bit. And so when he's using the term riwayat al-Zahira, it's unclear whether he's referring to a corpus of text or if he's referring to a corpus of transmission, that he's looking at this whole body of legal opinions that have come down to him from the Hanafi Imams, and based on his understanding of the transmission history of these texts or the content of the opinions, that he's saying this is the riwayat al-Zahira on this particular issue. Or was he using this, or was he simply saying that, well, everything found in Kitab al-Asl is a riwayah al-Zahira, or everything found in Jami al-Kabir is a riwayah al-Zahira? This is not entirely clear, but I lean towards the idea that he probably did associate it, at least to some degree, with a type of textual corpus. Now, the second thing that I wanted to discuss, this is the first appearance of Zahir al-Riwaya that we have with Abu Layth al-Samarkandi. We then have the popularization of Zahir al-Riwaya And this is something that emerges later on. And so when does this term actually become popularized? When does it become a regular feature of Hanafi legal discourse? Because in the works of Abu Layth Samarkandi, it's really, like I said, it's used not frequently at all, even though the way he uses it conveys to us that perhaps his audience was familiar with this terminology. And so what I did was I went through as many texts as I could, because I was very fearful that someone 10 years from now, especially with the rate of the number of works that are being published now, previously unpublished works, I was very fearful that someone would discover some bit of information and refute my article. So I tried to go through as many manuscripts, as many works as I could to see, okay, is anyone else using this term, Zahir al Riwaya? When do we see a shift from the usage of this term in a sort of infrequently to the usage of this term on a more frequent manner? And so over here, what you will see is that Al-Tahawi does not use the term, Al-Karhi does not use the term, Al-Jassas does not use the term. Abu Layth Samarkandi, as you mentioned, is the first person to use this particular term, but it's quite rare. It only appears 6 times in Nawazil and twice in Uyun al-Masail of his. Then you get Az-Zandawisati, and there's various ways of pronouncing his name, and there's a lot of khilaf on what his name actually is. Is it Yahya bin Ali? Is it Ali bin Yahya? Is it something else? So that's what I just mentioned, his last name over here, who is from Bukhara. He uses it in his Rawdat al-Ulama, and he uses it actually quite frequently. And the term that he uses is not Zahir al Riwaya, he uses Zahir al-Usul. This is the term that he uses. In fact, I don't think he uses Zahir al Riwaya at all, but he primarily uses the term Zahir al-Usul. And of course, in later taxonomies, Usul is considered synonymous with Zahir al Riwaya. Then you have Al-Quduri, who uses it in his Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karhi, which has now been published in full, so someone can read the whole book and see if my findings over here are accurate, because I've only sampled 2/3 of the text, but only 6 times. And the Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karhi is a very voluminous book, right? It's been published in 15 volumes or so, maybe 10 volumes, I can't remember anymore. Al-Jassas's book is extremely voluminous as well, but he only uses this term 6 times, and it is oftentimes unclear whether he's actually using it as a formal term, right? Because the idea of Zahir Riwaya can simply mean the Zahir of this Riwaya is X, or the Zahir of the Riwaya that I have mentioned, Yaqtadi this and that. It entails X, Y, and Z. And this is how Al-Quduri actually oftentimes uses it. And so in my paper, I mentioned that I do not think Al-Quduri is really, in most cases, is using this as a technical term, whereas Az-Zandawisati seems to be using Zahir al-Usul in a more technical manner to actually refer to a corpus of opinions. Then we have Abu Zayd al-Zabusi. Again, he uses it rarely in Ta'sis an-Nadhar. You have An-Natifi, only uses it a few times in Al-Ajnas, again, not as a technical term. Then you have An-Nasihi from Nishapur. He does not use the term at all. One of the things that you will recognize from this chart is that it is in the eastern lands of Samarkand and Bukhara where you find the clearest usage of this term as a technical term, right? In lands like Iraq, you either find scholars not using this term at all, or when they are using it, you do not really find it being used in a technical capacity. And when you look through this list over here of names and how frequently they're using the Zahir Riwaya, if they're using it at all, you will find that there is one name that sort of stands out, and that is As-Sarakhsi. Up until As-Sarakhsi's point, we have, okay, 6 references to Zahir Riwaya, okay, 6 over here, 6 over here, a few times over here. As-Sarakhsi comes on the scene, and all of a sudden it jumps to 300. And so he uses this term 300 times in Kitab al-Mabsut. And then after As-Sarakhsi, what you find is everyone after him is now using this technical term in their works, and they're using it very frequently, and it becomes sort of this established terminology in Hanafi legal discourse. And so Sadr Shahid uses it in pretty much all of his books. In Tuhfat al-Fuqaha of Alauddin al-Samarkandi, 99 times. Al-Kasani and Radiuddin al-Sarakhsi extremely frequently. Al-Marghinani uses it 150 times approximately in Al-Hidayah. And then Al-Qadi Khan, of course, uses it in his Fatawa. And so As-Sarakhsi seems to be this sort of transitional point between Zahir al Riwaya as a sparsely attested to concept or technical term versus one that becomes sort of very central to Hanafi legal discourse. And so the first observation from this chart is that the use of this term, like I said, is very much pronounced in the regions of Ma Wara al-Nahr, Samarkand and Bukhara, not so much in Iraq. And the second is that as-Sarakhsi is this pivotal figure who marks this transition between Zahir Riwaya as this sparsely attested to technical term versus one that is very frequently used in Hanafi legal literature. And so the question that I want to ask over here, or that I ask in my question is, can we really credit as-Sarakhsi or the Halwani-Sarakhsi school for this popularization or this interest now, or the shift in this doctrine of Zahir al-Riwaya and its reception by later jurists? And I argue yes. And the reason for this is two main reasons. First of all, Transoxiana becomes basically the hub of Hanafi activity during this time period. After the death of al-Quduri, Iraq basically ceases to become a prominent center of Hanafi activity. There's still Hanafis there, but when you look at later Hanafi legal literature, you do not find all the people who are being cited from the late 5th century onwards are people who are from Ma Wara al-Nahr, places like Samarkand and Bukhara, and Baghdad and Iraq is basically eclipsed, and there's no trace of it in much of our legal literature. Secondly, it is as-Sarakhsi and Halwani, even though there are many strands of Transoxani and Hanafism, it is Halwani and Sarakhsi school that basically dominates everything. They come to dominate everything, and this is identified also by Dr. Talal al-Azm when he says that when you look at the juristic chains of transmission of nearly all the major Transoxanian jurists of Tarjih and Tasheeh of the next 300 years, they all pass through al-Halwani, right? From the time of as-Sarakhsi or the time of al-Halwani, 3 centuries onwards, if you trace the chains of all major Hanafi jurists, they all go back to al-Halwani in some way or form. And so it is the school of al-Halwani basically that defines the history, orientation, doctrinal content, and legal processes of the school. And one of the things that are being defined by the Halwani and Sarakhsi school, or one of the things that they highlight, is the centrality of this concept of Zahir al Riwaya as a technical term to refer to a legal corpus that is oftentimes used in an authoritative capacity, but we will look at what that means. And so all these later scholars that we see over here in this diagram, where you have very frequent, very frequent, very frequent, very frequent, all of them have chains back to as-Sarakhsi, right? All of them in some way go back to the Halwani school. And this is a school that comes to dominate the madhab tradition. When you look at the works of these scholars, what you will find is they do clearly, just like Abu Layth Samarkandi is doing. Abu Layth Samarkandi, when he's using a riwayat al-Zahira, even though we're not sure whether he's referring to a textual corpus or a corpus of transmission, he's still using it in an authoritative sense. He's still using it, when he sees an opinion that perhaps is not from a riwayat al-Zahira, he will point out, oh, but this goes against a riwayat al-Zahira, or this position is ghayr mashhur, and the mashhur position is what is found in the riwayat al-Zahira. This indicates that there's some conception that this, whatever these jurists are viewing as a riwayat al-Zahira, has some authority to it. And this is what you find also in the works of people like Asad al-Shahid. He will oftentimes give fatwa on a position and he'll say, even though this opinion is against a riwayat al-Zahira or a Zahir riwayah, we're giving fatwa on it for X, Y, and Z reason. Similarly, Abu Nasr al-Isbijabi and Ali bin Muhammad al-Isbijabi, they will say the same thing. They are very conscious when they are selecting a non-Zahir riwayah opinion, that they point out that we know that this is against a riwayah al-Zahira, yet we are selecting this because of X, Y, or Z reason. However, and this is the last thing that I'll mention, even though this is the case, what is interesting about this particular century of jurists over here after as-Sarakhsi, these jurists over here, is that we do actually have a number of fatwa guidelines from scholars of the century, and really no one mentions a Zahir riwayah as part of a formal fatwa process. And so I've looked at 5 actually 6, I haven't mentioned one name over here, 6 statements in our law books from this period where these jurists are outlining a process of fatwa, from Ali al-Ispijabi, al-Ushi in his fatawa work, Radiyuddin al-Sarakhsi in al-Muhit, Abu Nasr al-Abtabi in his fatawa, and Qadi Khan in his fatawa work. And how many of them, they will mention, you know, if Abu Hanifa is on one side and the Sahibain are on the other side, you take X opinion. If Abu Hanifa is joined by one of his companions, you choose the jurist has a choice of choosing X or Y. They'll mention various guidelines to guide the mufti in terms of how he's supposed to be giving fatwa, but none of these processes actually mention Zahir al Riwaya. And the first person to actually mention Zahir al Riwaya as a part of fatwa procedure is Qadi Khan. And even Qadi Khan is opposed in his conception of Zahir al Riwaya by al-Ghaznawi, who is a student of Abu Bakr al-Kasani. Because Qadi Khan, what he says is basically, when a position is found in Zahir al Riwaya, you give fatwa on Zahir al Riwaya unless, you know, something like urf or darura or something of that sort. Whereas al-Ghaznawi says that when something is part of this Zahir al Riwaya corpus, the jurist exercises his own ijtihad when there's various opinions ascribed to the Hanafi masters, and some of those opinions are found in are what is zahir from these imams, then the jurist should choose what is the strongest opinion in his eyes from the perspective of evidence. And so even during this phase, Zahir al-Riwaya is being popularized, but it is still not finding a place in fatwa guidelines that these jurists are putting down, except for Qadi Khan, who is the first one to give Zahir al-Riwaya that really authoritative first order precedent standing that we then find becoming mainstream in the later Hanafi school. And in fact, you know, going to Sheikh Suhail's point about how these Hanafi jurists are working off of a broader corpus, what Radiyuddin al-Sarakhsi, when he presents these various corpuses of Hanafi law, he does not present them in terms of one is first order precedent, one is second order precedent in the process of giving fatwa. Rather, he gives them each a type of pedagogical function, and he links them in a way where they all sort of complement each other to convey this broader, wider corpus of Hanafi legal rulings. And so he says at the very beginning of his Muhit al-Radawi that I begin every chapter with legal cases in the Mabsut, and by this he means Kitab al-Asl, because they are the firm foundation, Usul Mabniya. I complement this with the legal cases in the Nawadir, since they are extracted from the foundational cases. And so this is really interesting because his understanding of Nawadir is not simply that these are second order precedent, right? These are less authoritative opinions. Rather, he sees the Nawadir as opinions that are being extracted from these foundational cases that are found in Mabsut. And Al-Hasiri, who's a later Hanafi scholar, a student of Qadi Khan, also gives the Nawadir this function of being a source that has pedagogical value in terms of giving insights into the usul of the Hanafi masters and their approach. And so what we find throughout this period is what Sheikh Suhail mentions, and I've quoted him over here in my paper, and I'll just read this paragraph, and then this is, I think, the last slide, that although Zahir al-Riwaya had become prominent in the 5th and 6th centuries and increasingly was referred to by jurists, it had not become authoritative in the manner it would in later periods. In the historical memory of the Hanafi school, jurists from this period are assigned the rank of Ashab al-Tarjih. One of their primary activities was to assess the legal opinions transmitted from the early Hanafi masters with a view to rule formulation, while operating within specific parameters such as not deviating from the opinions of the Hanafi masters. These jurists were not restricted to Zahir al-Riwaya in their tarjih by any formal and generally acknowledged rule. This was also the case in earlier periods when the various sources for the opinions of the Hanafi masters were, in the words of Sheikh Suhail Hanif, treated as one body of knowledge, and the production of a unified school doctrine involved generational efforts to negotiate a large number of sources that existed in the pre-classical period of the school. And this is what you find in the works of al-Jassas, in the works of al-Quduri, in the works of Sadr al-Shahid, in the works of al-Sarakhsi, and even in time periods where the concept of Zahir al Riwaya, the concept of mashhur, is emerging, and there is a clear move to identify some type of authoritative corpus. Still, many of these jurists in the 6th century who are from the Ashab al-Tarjih are not bound or do not see themselves bound to this Zahir al Riwaya corpus in terms of their legal discourse and in terms of their activity of fatwa. There are a lot of more details that I could mention. You can, about how Zahir al Riwaya spread from Transoxania to Syria. You'll see in this chart over here that there's an interesting shift you go from Bukhara and now you're heading to Syria, right? And so it is actually these people connected to Sarakhsi and the scholars of Ma Wara Nahar, there's a westward migration towards places like Aleppo and Damascus. And with that westward migration, you also find the move or the spread of the concept of Zahir al-Riwaya to these other regions as well. You can refer to my paper for the details of that and various other details. And I also mentioned in my paper what Zahir al-Riwaya denoted during this early period. I looked at about 50 instances of the phrase being used in Alauddin Samarkandi's Tuhfat al-Fuqaha, and to try to determine what he intended by that phrase. And I won't mention that right now because I'm probably out of time, but because Sheikh Suhail, I think, took a lot of time, I decided that I could take advantage of that as well. But I will stop there and I will leave any questions that people have regarding that issue of what the term denotes to the Q&A, inshallah. So barakallahu feekum, and I hope this was beneficial. And like I said, more details can be found in the paper itself. Jazakumullah khairan.